So let's talk about personal injury documentation and specifically the importance of subjective versus objective documentation. And this is very important, more so in personal injury, because you have to, you not only have to quantify as much of the data as possible. That's a big key word in chiropractic. There's some major keywords. One is personal injury. Quantify is a big one. Scientific is a big one. Subjective and objective are big ones. Those are big words, very important words, more so than if you have a general family practice. So in the subjective portion, it's based on or influenced by personal feelings, taste, or opinions. So that's the subjective. And the objective is not influenced by personal feelings, opinions, in considering or representing the facts. And so what's the reason you need to know this? You need to know the relativeness of this is what you need to know for. It's the relativeness of subjective versus objective. And this is very, very important, especially with minor impact soft tissue injuries, number one, because they're harder to document, generally speaking. They're harder to document from a objective standpoint. That's the big problem with soft tissue injuries. Broken bones are easy. And what's sad about it is typically you break a long bone as long as it's not in the joint, and 4 to 6 weeks later it's healed. You will not have any problems whatsoever with that broken bone. But everybody sees that it's a broken bone, and everybody can relate to a broken bone, and so a broken bone typically will get more money than a soft tissue injury. Well, the soft tissue injury, especially in the joints, will almost definitely alter joint function and cause altered orthokinematics, and it's the beginning stages of arthritis. And in other words, it becomes a permanent problem. It becomes a permanent problem, and it affects people the rest of their lives, where the broken bone heals and goes away. So juries will naturally give more money to a broken bone than a soft tissue injury, and that is only if you cannot show it. And so that's why understanding the difference between subjective and objective is so important in minor impact soft tissue injuries. And the more objective, the better, but it's basically accumulation. So what is the personal injury documentation goal? It's to use multiple forms of subjective and scientific objective documentation, which correlates and leads to an obvious and logical conclusion. So you want the spectrum. You're already going to get the subjective part is not the hard part. That's the easy part, but the bad news is if you just have subjective information and you do not have any objective information, you got a really bad case. And it's going to be very easy to defeat your case in court. And so that's why learning some of these objective documentation tools are vital in treating the minor impact soft tissue injury case, which is the chiropractic personal injury case. So let's go into this discussion specifically, and we're going to kind of look at this as a scale of 1 to 10, from totally subjective to 10 being totally objective. And let's go ahead and evaluate each of these components. And so you have the patient's history. So we'll kind of just start through and go into each of these components. And by the way, you do need to be familiar with this relative to attorneys, because a lot of times the attorneys don't really know as much of subjective or objective, or if they do, especially the insurance attorney, if they do, they put all the emphasis saying that everything you're doing is subjective. So you better know how to do objective testing and 100% objective testing, and then also correlate, be able to take subjective and objective and the intermediate, some of it subjective and some of it's objective, and connecting all those dots, because they will. That's one of the arguments they'll say, is that all your information is subjective. And they'll just say basically it's false because it's all up to the patient. And so you have to be able to know this, how to document and explain subjective versus objective, and then connect them. And it is important to use subjective with objective, not just objective. I mean, you want to get the patient's feelings in this. How do they feel about it? But you darn well do not only want subjective. That's a very, very weak case. So having said that, when you look at the patient's history, that's essentially subjective. You're relying on the patient. You're relying on the patient and what he has to say. So that will be, the patient's history will be a very easy part of the case for the insurance attorney to attack you on. And I'm really talking about the verbal part of history, not if there was, some history that had some objective testing that was documented. That's a whole different story. I'm just referring to the part of the history of the patient saying what they say happened. Well, what they say happened is totally subjective, and that's why also it's so important that you understand and document the mechanism of injury. As a physician, you have to be able to explain what anatomy has high probability of being injured from a mechanism of injury, and that this correlates, that this accident is cause of this injury. And remember, that's number one in the 4 pillars of personal injury, is you definitively saying this accident, in my opinion, caused this injury. And that's from the mechanism of injury, not relying just on the patient, what he says, but the mechanism of injury and how it impacted the anatomy. And that has nothing to do with the subjective. So the accident report, for the most part, is subjective also. Basically, when the police show up, they're just going to ask, how fast were you going? Unless there was video documentation or something like that, or sometimes, the bigger cases, they'll do a forensic analysis of, how far the car skidded, look at the skid marks, the weight of the vehicle, and then they can get more of an accurate scientific evaluation of, speed and all that. But that's not a minor impact soft tissue injury case. You're never going to come across those in your life in all likelihood. So just be aware that the accident report is typically what the people said, so it's subjective also. So just be aware of that. Just because it's an accident report that was filled out by a police officer does not mean it's objective. So be aware. Don't get caught thinking that just because the police officer wrote it out that it's objective. It's not. He basically took the people's opinions. Well, how fast were you going? How fast were they going? Things like that. So same with the consultation. That's going to be totally subjective. The range of motion exam. So when you're doing the physical range of motion exam, what degree of that is subjective versus objective? Well, now you're starting to get into the physician's experience. So it's more subjective, especially active range of motion. Active range of motion is totally subjective. You're asking the patient to bend forward, backward, left, right. Okay, so that is totally subjective. And you just need to be aware to be able to explain the difference. There's active, overpressure and the paraphysiological joint motion. So remember, there's always 3 ranges of motion. And remember, the insurance attorneys don't know this. So when they say range of motion, make sure you clarify. By the way, make sure you document accordingly too. You should be documenting active range of motion as well as passive range of motion in the physical exam. And the x-rays will help determine intersegmental motion. Or joint motion. So active range of motion is totally subjective. Now, overpressure is coordination. It's not just subjective, it's a physician function. See, so now we're starting to get away from subjective. In other words, you're going to feel for resistance. So you will feel joint resistance. And you should know as a physician when you feel joint resistance versus muscular guarding. And so that's your opinion. That's not their opinion. So that's objective. That's your objective. So that's how overpressure starts to become a combination of objective and subjective overpressure. And then when you go into joint motion, intersegmental joint motion, that is totally objective. An example is a fixation. If you were to, that's why documenting fixations is important too, like C5, C6 fixation on the left, lateral flexion, whatever. You see, the patient cannot create a fixation. A patient cannot control individual intersegmental motion or fixations. A patient cannot. So fixations are totally objective. So be aware of that. So you guys see, when you're looking at range of motion, you're looking at three totally different types of range of motion, one totally subjective and one totally objective, and then one in the middle. So you need to be aware of that and be able to describe it. And by the way, you should also be documenting this. And then you go to muscle testing. That's a common test. Well, muscle testing is a physician function. And of course, we use the AMA guides, grade of 5, grade 1 through 0 through 5 muscle testing scale. And so how subjective or objective is muscle testing? And it's against gravity, and it's not totally subjective, and it is a physician function because you're going to be testing for weakness. But it still it's a large portion subjective. So just be aware of that basically the person has to initiate resistance. And so it's going to be up to them. Now, one of the things that happens that helps increase the accuracy of muscle testing is the machines, like the JTEC machines. But by the way, I do not recommend that you get those for minor impact soft tissue injuries. But one of the things that does happen is when you take a machine and you test against the machine. But now remember, that's not a physician, that's not an AMA guided muscle testing procedure. It's a muscle testing based on the impairment or AMA guides is a physician function, not a machine function. So be aware there's a difference there. And I always stick with scientific. One of the things I always say is just do everything by the book with scientific, the way it should be done with the science. And that way nothing can be called into question. Where if you do one little thing that's skeptical, and you have a good attorney, he can take that one little thing that's skeptical and just blow it up, and now it discredits everything you're doing. And that's why I never did anything that would discredit, and everything I did was scientific based. So muscle testing, so it becomes more, so it's a catch-22. Well, first of all, you don't want to get JTEC machines because we're just not going to have, for minor impact soft tissue injuries, we're not going to have muscle impairments. That's just not going to happen. In 20 plus years, I've never given a muscle impairment rating. Chiropractors, and remember, muscle weakness is not from pain, it's from a neurological lesion. So typically the only weakness you'll get with muscle testing is a grade 4, and it won't be from a neurological component. Typically it's a grade 4 weakness because of pain. And then typically it gets stronger as the pain goes away, you clear it up. So it's not a true muscle weakness. So that's why I don't recommend JTEC. It's not appropriate for the minor impact soft tissue injury. But having said that, and it's also not AMA guide based. So those are the 2 reasons I don't recommend. But having said that, you can get more specific muscle testing by using the machines and correlating and doing reproducibility. So in other words, if you tested the deltoid with the machine and then reproduce it 3 times. Well, it's very difficult to reproduce something 3 times with close consistency. In other words, subjective. Usually when you're doing it on your own, there's going to be a high variable. And so that's a clue that it's more it's more false and it's not a true positive test. But if you reproduce the test, say 3 times, and all 3 times it's within a very small margin of error, now you have very good reliability, much higher reliability. So just be aware of that. So do I recommend using those machines? No. For the 2 reasons I told you, it's not AMA based and it's not a physician, and you're not going to see much muscle injuries at all. So having said that, you go to reflexes now. So reflexes, subjective or objective? Well, most people can produce a twitch. Most people. they can't produce, they typically cannot reproduce repetitive twitches, like a aberrant reflex, a hyper reflex. And so I would suggest that it's mostly objective. A reflex is mostly objective. But because it is a twitch, it's not a voluntary contraction. Remember, a voluntary contraction is subjective. A twitch is not subjective. That's neurological. So it's an upper motor twitch. And so it is physician interpreted, but I guess what I'm saying is you better know how to describe the difference between a voluntary contraction and an involuntary twitch, reflexive twitch due to a hypersensitive reflex. So it's largely objective, especially when you reproduce it, like you do it 2 or 3 times to verify it. It's very difficult to create a voluntary twitch repetitively and consistently with the stimulus, in other words, the reflex hammer. So that can still be attacked, even though it's an upper motor lesion and there's no voluntary contraction at all. It still can be attacked. It still can be, depending on how good the lawyer is, it still can be clouded over, so to speak, but it is definitely more objective than subjective. And then dermatones are just not totally, but massively subjective. And there's a lot of problems with dermatones. Number one, you're not going to find very many positive at all. I've never given a dermatome impairment rating ever. I've never had any documented in a minor impact soft tissue injury case. And so, remember, those would be ultimately determined by electrical diagnostics. So dermatomes would be evaluated initially as really just a cursory scan. But the finality of that, the neurological lesion, is from electrodiagnostic testing, and that's totally objective. And you just will not find, with minor impacts, rare to never, that you'll find a positive electrodiagnostic test for a dermatome in a minor impact soft tissue injury going under 20 miles an hour. So you got several problems with that. So it can be subjective, largely, especially if the person is somewhat familiar with dermatome patterns. Then, yes, they can. Again, reproduction helps it. Doing it multiple times helps it. But also, it's not a very positive finding either. So, dermatomes is again one of those tests that I do not want to hang my hat on. If that's the only positive test I have, I'm settling out of court. I do not want to go to court and try to defend dermatomes based on a physician evaluation, and that's the only biometric I have. There's no way I'm going to court to defend that one. So that just kind of gives you an idea of subjective versus objective in dermatomes. So it is not a objective test. There's not a lot of objective tests. That's why soft tissue injuries are so difficult especially if you don't know what you're doing. That's why they're so difficult. And so what's important is the accumulation of all these tests. That's what's so important, is combining these tests. And then you go to orthopedic tests. And so mostly orthopedic tests are subjective, again. And then you would want to throw in a couple malingering tests to help counter any talk of subjectivity. But once again, you're talking about a lot of subjectivity with orthopedic tests. And then you have the functional capacity indexes. So I'm going to talk about the Oswestry scale, neck disability index, Roland Morris. Those are some of the functional capacity indexes, even when you get into pain diagrams. And those have a lot of now they're highly reproducible, and they've shown a lot of consistency. So in the science category, they have shown consistency. And by the way, it's because they're regular and consistent, and how they're delivered. They'll use opposing questions also to help validate a particular question. So there's a lot of validity in the functional capacity indexes, and they are important, but you still have to have that person fill it out and their opinion. So that still leaves the door open for subjectivity, even though there is especially when there's consistency, when you show consistency. And remember, what's so important is not only to show the consistency of different time periods, they're given at each re-exam, the initial exam and re-exams, but also correlating all these other tests that are subjective. You see, that's part of the equation. That's the equation, is correlating everything. And so you're at the orthopedic test, functional capacity test, and then the Glasgow Coma Scale. That's a cursory. If there's any signs or history of dizziness, blacking out, loss of memory, then they should have a quick Glasgow Coma Scale. And all that is again, that's subjective. That's the patient answering questions. So there's, again, a lot of validity toward it, especially when you combine all of these, when you combine mechanism of injury, when you combine the history, the accident report, the consultation, the reflexes, the dermatomes, the orthopedic test, the range of motion. See, the more of these that you do and you document well, the greater, even though all of them that we've set up to this point are subjective, I still can put a very good case together because how I can correlate them all. So that's the key, is putting them all together to correlate them. So functional capacity and the Glasgow Coma Scale, that's subjective essentially also. And if you had any positives there, then that would be sent off to a neuropsychologist. So, and then you got the neuropsychologist behavioral evaluation. And it's the same thing. It's a high likelihood. There's a high likelihood, but it's still subjective. The patient has to put in their input. So it is not 100% objective. But it's strongly suggestive of objective. So you need to be able to do this. Now, by the way, most of the time, none of this will happen until you're in a deposition or you're doing a testimony. That's typically when this really comes out. So you just need to be familiar on how to explain these spectrums from totally subjective to totally objective to somewhere in between to connecting all the dots, that they're all consistent. And so there's a thing called an algometer, and that's one of the reasons for an algometer. All it looks like, if you're not familiar with it, it's a little tool that looks like what's that type of treatment? Anyway, it's a little device, and it's a measuring device. So it has a little rubber head on it, and then there's, at the other end of it, looks like a pencil. At the other end, there's a gauge, and the gauge measures pressure. So when you push down, the gauge moves. And essentially what happens is you can go to painful areas and just push and basically feel for pain. Tell me when you feel pain. So say you pick certain trigger points out, the neck or the shoulders, and you can do, this is one of the biometrics that you can use. Now this has a high degree of objectivity, even though the patient says pain. What makes it a high degree of sensitivity is the numbers. It's very hard subjectively to be consistent. Now, when you're doing the same area like 3 times, you press on the same area 3 times. The algometer, if they're being truthful, the pain will register in a similar zone, pressure zone. If they're not, it'll fluctuate wildly. In other words, it's very difficult, once again, kind of like what I said with the muscle testing. It's very difficult to subjectively control and say, oh, when it hits 100 millimeters of pressure is when I'm going to feel pain. No, we don't have that kind of sensitivity control. And so that's why an algometer, and I used it. It was a very easy tool, and I had my specific check, the common trigger points in the neck and shoulder, and I just test it, reproduce it, and measure it. It was just another good more objective than subjective biometric for pain sensitivity. That's what it was. That's what it was. And then there's the NCV, nerve conduction, and of course that's 100% objective. And of course the bad news is you're not going to have essentially any positive findings. I don't think I know for a fact I never gave any impairment ratings for a positive NCV or an EMG, never. And so again, minor impact soft tissue injury cases, those are findings that you won't find. And so that's why, you know, these chiropractors who don't know how to document a minor impact soft tissue injury and they use standard medical testing like muscle test, reflexes, NCD, EMGs, they're going to have a boatload of negative tests. So NCV is hugely objective, totally objective. EMG is totally objective, but you're not going to find them. It's not a very sensitive test for a minor impact injury test. And that's the deal with electrodiagnostics, all electrodiagnostic studies. That's the problem. So they're great objective-wise, but you're just not going to find those tests positive for minor impact soft tissue injury. So they're bad. Essentially, they're bad for the minor impact soft tissue injury case. Now, I'm still going to do them. If I have any type of referred pain, I'm going to ask for a neurological consult and ask his opinion. Do you think we need to run any further electrodiagnostic testing? That's what I'm going to ask the neurologist. Ask him to consult the patient and ask his opinion. I'm not going to order the test. I'm going to ask the neurologist test. Remember, that's the medical team. You can't be everything to everybody. So then it comes the blood test. You go, well, that's 100% objective also. But then you're back to which tests are sensitive or going to be more sensitive in a minor impact soft tissue case. And I've talked about this before, that what we look for is inflammatory indicators. And the main ones are sedimentation rate. And basically when the cells are destroyed, protein's released. It measures the protein in the blood. That's the sedimentation rate. Other things can affect that, working out, strenuous workouts, things like that. But it's 100%. It's 100% objective, but it's not real sensitive. It's not as sensitive as what you get. So the main test for inflammatory indexes is the sedimentation rate, and then the lipid profile, the ratio of high density to low density lipoproteins. That's an inflammatory indicator. It's more of a systemic inflammatory indicator. Lipid profile, the ratio. And then there's what's called C-reactive protein. And now there's a more sensitive called a hypersensitive or high-sensitive C-reactive protein test. So there's a C-reactive protein, and now there's a more sensitive test called a high-sensitive C-reactive test. And then there's another, and those are all inflammatory indicators. So they're supporting if there's inflammation in the body. And by the way, those tests, over and over, if you have, that's when you're a real doctor in front of a jury. When you have taken the blood test, even if they're positive or not positive, and you did blood test, now you have huge credit. That's the number one test that you can do to get huge trust and credibility, blood tests. Everybody trusts blood tests. So you just won't have a lot of positive findings with minor impact soft tissue injuries. So those are the main tests. Inflammatory indicators for the blood test, and then you go to the X-rays, and what is so important there are the motion X-rays, and the reason is they're totally same. Static X-rays, the patient still can move, but that's not even as important because we're living human beings. We move. So obviously what's real important with minor impact soft tissue injuries is motion X-rays. That's the number one test right there, is the motion X-rays. And the number one finding, and it's 100% objective, 100%. There's no subjectivity at all, because the patient cannot control intrinsic muscles of the vertebra. Patients have no voluntary control over. And so you need to be able to explain this to attorneys, to a jury, Attorneys don't know what I'm sharing with you right now. This is why it's so important that you know this and you can make comments and opinions based on what is subjective and what is objective and what degree in the middle. So the x-rays are totally 100% objective because there's none of us can control intersegmental movement. So whatever aberration of intersegmental movement there is, it's totally objective. And remember, that's where you'll have a lot of adhesions. These things in chiropractic called fixations. And that's what happens as a result of the second phase of healing, the repair phase of healing. When that type 3 collagen goes in there, it goes in there in a mixed matched way. And then when it heals wrong, doesn't get the right physical medicine, specifically in joint motion or in a paraphysiological joint motion, that's when you have adhesions. And in chiropractic, we know that as fixations, and it shows up on an X-ray as altered orthospinal kinetic movement. That's the number one minor impact soft tissue injury, and it's the most objective. It's 100% objective. Now, every now and then, a small percent, say 25 to 30% of the time, there'll be enough energy and trauma to the area where it'll go into anatomical failure. But most of the time, 70% of the time, you'll have inflammation in there. And when it heals, it causes adhesions. And that alters how the spinal segments move. And patients cannot control that. That's a pathological process. That's an impairment rating. That means that's a pathological process, the beginning of osteoarthritis. That's a permanent impairment. That's huge. You have to do that. And then you have the MRI. And of course, the MRI is good for disc injuries. It's 100% objective. It's great for disc injuries, but it doesn't. You're not showing motion. So, it's real important to stress these joints and do the test like a motion X-ray. But MRI is obviously good for disc. CAT scan, same thing. But for minor impact injuries, without a disc, an MRI is worthless. It can show inflammation. You can have it more sensitive for inflammation, so you can do that. But you're looking at a basic MRI. If there's no disc injury, it's going to come back normal. So CAT scan, same thing. It's 100% objective. Patient can't control any of it. And then there's the CRMA, computerized radiograph mensuration analysis. That is just measuring the adhesions of the spine. That it's objective, but just be aware that there's a person that has to mark the dots. So the computer measures the angles of the lines, but a human being has to put the dots. So that's the weak part. Wherever the human is the weak part. So if the human didn't put the dots in the right places, then you got, and if you're a good attorney, that's the angle of attack I'm going to come at with CRMA, is that different people can put dots in different places on the vertebra, not the exact same place, and now we have a different measurement. That's where I'm going to come at CRMA. But otherwise, it's for the most part, objective, a large degree objective test, CRMA. So these are the differences between. I just listed the common tests. I want to share with you some tests that chiropractors do that are not good. And so we look at what's called junk science. And junk science is not established in peer-reviewed or referee or scholarly journals. And that's what the definition is, not if it works or not. The definition is whether it has been reproducible and it's been shown to be reproduced in refereed scholarly journals. That's what makes something not junk science. So articles written by experts are reviewed by several other experts in the field before the article is published in the journal in order to ensure the article's quality. Most of the time, the results have to be reproducible. Well, some not highly accurate or reproducible testing that chiropractors use. One is thermography. It is called junk science. Now, let me say up front that 80% of the attorney, if you're doing any of this junk science as part of your substantiating an injury, 80%, remember there's 3 different types of attorneys, A, B, and C attorneys. And 80% of the attorneys will not even know what we're talking about. They will not know how to attack this junk science. But if you do get an A attorney or a decent B attorney, he will know to attack this junk science. And remember, depending on how strongly he attacks it, is how much he can destroy your credibility, and then take that destroyed credibility and then spread it over everything you're saying, everything else that you've said. And that's what destroys a case or weakens a case significantly. So you can do a really good job and then do some junk science, and now you have an attorney who attacks it. And by the way, and now you got trouble. Now you just lost, you just set yourself up to lose the case and do a bad job. So this is one of the reasons that I never, ever used junk science. I didn't care if there was a billing and you got paid for it. I know that's what a lot of chiropractors, not just chiropractors, medical doctors do the same thing. Do what's getting paid. There's a reason why there's a lot of cesarean sections with babies. That's what gets paid. So not highly accurate or reproducible. So thermography is not reproducible. I mean, it's not intra-tester reproducible. Who's doing it? The room has to be the venting has to be proper for thermography. The thermographics of the room have to be proper. The patient's setting. I mean, there's so many variables that you just can't control that cannot be reproduced. That's why it's never made it big time. That's why it's never made it on the big stage. It's not reproducible. Same with surface EMGs. Chiropractors started hanging their hats on surface EMGs, and it's not reproducible. It's the same thing. Intra-tester reliability is terrible. It's not reproducible. If it was, it would be in the peer-reviewed journals. It's not. I'm not saying that thermography might not benefit you somehow. I'm not saying that surface EMG might not benefit you somehow. But is it a high-quality, reproducible test? No, it's not. I mean, even within the same office, have the head doctor do the thermography and have the associate doctor do the thermography, and a lot of times you'll come out with different readings. Because the air conditioner kicked on during the associate's thermography reading, and it didn't kick on when the head doctor did it. Just, all kinds of stuff like that. And then there's, the big chiropractic neurocolometer, the B.J. Palmer neurocolometer. That's junk science. It's not reproducible. Is it an indicator? Yeah, you could use it as an indicator, but I'm just saying I didn't even use anything that was considered junk science because I didn't want any of these factors to diminish my strength of testimony in anything else I was saying. And so I recommend don't do any junk science, even if you get paid for it. I just recommend don't doing it. Now, if you are doing it, then, like I said, 80% chance you're not going to get called to the task. But if you get a good attorney on there, and if you do enough personal injury, every now and then you're going to run into a good attorney, and then it might be a big case. You might have a big case, and then you might be doing 1 or 2 junk science on here. And let me tell you, if I have you on the stand for 6 hours, I'm going to spend 5.5 hours on your junk science. That's how much I'm going to blow it up and really go into destroying you. So, same with applied kinesiology, muscle testing. That's not reproducible. These are all chiropractic, typical chiropractic things chiropractors use. Well, it's called junk science. It's not reproducible. It's not things you want to use in personal injury. So these are some of the major factors that I wanted to point out with subjective versus objective. And the reason is you're not going to hit a grand slam home run with any one particular thing. Even if you have an ALMSI, you still want other factors. And just so you know, if you have ALMSI and there's no subjective or objective findings, there's no other findings, that's an irrelevant injury. So the injury has to be consistent with the signs, symptoms, and the accident. So this is why it's so important to have all of these measures. have things that are totally subjective, have things that are somewhat subjective, somewhat objective, have things that are more objective and less subjective, and then have things that are totally objective. That's really what you want in a personal injury case. And then you want them all to correspond relative to your diagnosis and your impression and your statement of permanent injury and how it's impacting, limiting, or restricting the person's life. And that's what you want to do. So just be aware, you do want to know the difference between subjective and objective. And a lot of times that is, by the way, this is the number one problem with minor impact soft tissue injuries. It's the difficulty for somebody who doesn't know what they're doing. When you know what you're doing, it's not that difficult. When you don't know what you're doing, you will have no subject. Essentially, you won't even have a case. So the chiropractor, and remember, this is the difference with minor impact soft tissue injuries, is they're hard to objectively document. So this is why it's so important to understand the difference between subjective and objective and the spectrum in between and how to align them up. And in closing, I'll just give you a simple example. So a chiropractor who doesn't know how to do this, he typically gets the auto injury, and what's he do? He puts cervical strain down. He doesn't document anything with altered intersegmental motion or LMSI because he didn't even know it. So he has no disc, no peripheral nerve, no mild concussion. So essentially he's got nothing documented for an injury. And then he has no impairment rating. And typically if he doesn't have those two, he doesn't know how to document overpressure. In other words, he doesn't know there's three ranges of motion with loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities and duties under duress. And that positive finding in a minor impact soft tissue injury will be from overpressure. So typically he will not have that documented either. And then he will not know how to document a permanent injury and given an impairment rating based on the AMA guides. So you take it, that is the typical loser chiropractic documentation case. And I'd easily say 95% of chiropractors, I just told you how they document personal injury. They don't. And then somebody who does know how to document the case will come up and they'll take the signs and symptoms, they'll match it with the objective findings, correlate it with the quality quantity, and then they'll correlate it with the mechanism of injury relative to the signs and symptoms. And then they'll include subjective, moderate subjective and objective, and totally objective findings. And they'll find altered intersegmental motion as a diagnosis or alteration of motion segment integrity. They'll find it and document it, and they'll objectively document it. And then they'll go and get an impairment rating for it because now they know how to do it. They've been trained it. And then they know how to document loss of enjoyment of lifetime activities, ADLs, and duties under duress with overpressure because they understand the difference between the three ranges of motion and the last one, overpressure, is the one that's going to be where you're going to find the problems in all likelihood. Then they're going to know how to do MMI and do the need for future care. So contrast those two cases. One is the loser documentation that the attorney has absolutely nothing to go on and is terrible for the patient and their claim. And the other one actually documents the case objectively, subjectively, and objectively, correlates it all, makes sense of it based on the three phases of healing, quantifies it, and then gives it its impairment rating and need for future care. Now the attorney. Both of these are the same injuries, and that's why it's night and day difference between a chiropractor who knows how to document minor impact soft tissue injuries versus those who don't. And 95% of chiropractors don't have a clue. The good news is, when you do know how to document this, number one, and then you know how to do what's called educational sales. When you know how to sell it, that's where there's huge opportunity and huge business and no competition.